The morning sun painted the sky in soft orange and pink colors as Detective James finished his usual 5-mile run through Greenfield Heights. His running shoes hit the pavement in a steady rhythm that had become second nature after 20 years in law enforcement. The neighborhood was exactly what he had dreamed of when he was growing up in the inner city. Perfect lawns, white picket fences, and the kind of quiet that only money could buy. James had worked his entire career to afford a house in this subdivision. Every overtime shift, every dangerous undercover assignment, every sleepless night tracking down the worst criminals in the country had led to this moment. 3 months ago, he had finally gotten the keys to 1247 Maple Street, a beautiful 2-story colonial with a wraparound porch and a garden that his late mother would have loved. As he walked up his driveway, sweat still cooling on his forehead, James grabbed the garden hose to water his new flower beds. The roses were just starting to bloom, and the tulips his neighbor Mrs. Chen had given him as a housewarming gift were showing bright yellow heads. Gardening was his new hobby, something peaceful to balance out the chaos of his day job. But as he stood there with the water flowing over his hands, something caught his attention. A white sedan with heavily tinted windows was driving slowly past his house. Very slowly, the kind of slow that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. James had been an FBI agent for 15 years, specializing in organized crime and domestic terrorism. His instincts had kept him alive through situations most people only saw in movies. The car stopped at the corner, idled for a moment, then made a U-turn and drove past again. James kept watering his flowers but tracked the vehicle with his peripheral vision. White Ford sedan, newer model, no front license plate visible, windows tinted beyond legal limits for this state. The driver appeared to be a white male, but the passenger was harder to make out. When the car made its third pass in 10 minutes, James knew this wasn't random. He had seen this pattern before during surveillance operations. Someone was watching him, studying his routine, learning his habits. The question was why. James turned off the hose and walked toward his front porch, moving casually but keeping the sedan in sight. As he reached for his door handle, he saw the car slow down again, this time stopping directly across from his house. 2 men sat inside, and while he couldn't see their faces clearly, their body language suggested they were having an intense conversation. His phone buzzed with a text message. It was from his partner at the FBI, Agent Rodriguez. "Everything okay? Got a weird call about suspicious activity in your neighborhood. Some resident reported concerning behavior at your address." James stared at the message. Concerning behavior? He had been doing nothing but normal homeowner activities since moving in. Mowing his lawn, getting his mail, working in his garden, unless being a black man in this neighborhood was somehow considered concerning behavior. The white sedan suddenly pulled away, tires squealing slightly as it accelerated down the street. James memorized the partial license plate he could see and made a mental note to run it through the system later, but something told him this wasn't over. Over the next hour, James tried to enjoy his Saturday morning. He made coffee, read the newspaper on his porch, and planned out his weekend projects. But the feeling of being watched never left him. Twice more he spotted the same white sedan cruising through the neighborhood. Once it was accompanied by a black SUV with similar tinted windows. Around noon, James noticed something else strange. Several of his neighbors were standing in small groups on their lawns, talking quietly and occasionally glancing toward his house. When he waved in their direction, they quickly looked away or went back inside their homes. Mrs. Peterson, the elderly woman who lived next door, had always been friendly since he moved in. She had brought him homemade cookies and helped him figure out which day was trash pickup. But today, when he saw her checking her mailbox, she avoided eye contact completely. James decided to take a walk around the block, partly for exercise and partly to see what was really going on. As he strolled down Maple Street, he noticed more unusual activity. A man he had never seen before was sitting in a parked car, talking on his phone while watching James walk by. Another stranger was standing at the corner with what looked like a clipboard, as if he was conducting some kind of survey. When James turned onto Oak Avenue, he saw a small crowd gathered outside the community center. About 15 people were standing in a circle, having what appeared to be a heated discussion. As he got closer, he could hear fragments of their conversation. "Property values are important to all of us," one man was saying. "We have to think about our families," a woman added. There are ways to handle this situation legally. Another voice chimed in. James slowed his pace, pretending to check his phone while listening. It became clear that he was the subject of their discussion. Words like background check, safety concerns, and neighborhood standards drifted over to him. His stomach tightened as he realized what was happening. These people were organizing against him, not because of anything he had done, but simply because of who he was. They saw a black man in their exclusive neighborhood and automatically assumed he didn't belong, despite the fact that he had paid the same high prices they had for his home, and probably had a more extensive background check than any of them. James continued his walk, maintaining his calm exterior while his mind raced. He had faced down international terrorists, infiltrated violent criminal organizations, and testified against some of the most dangerous people in the country. But somehow buying a house in suburbia was turning into one of his biggest challenges yet. As he walked back toward his house, James noticed the white sedan had returned. This time it was parked 3 houses down from his, and he could see both occupants more clearly. They were wearing what looked like security uniforms, dark shirts with patches and badges. But something was off about their appearance. The uniforms looked cheap, like costumes rather than real law enforcement gear. James reached his front door and paused, key in hand. His FBI training had taught him to trust his instincts, and right now every instinct was screaming that trouble was coming. The question wasn't if something was going to happen, but when. He looked back at the white sedan one more time. The 2 men inside were staring directly at him now, no longer trying to hide their surveillance. One of them picked up what looked like a radio and began speaking into it. James went inside and immediately called his supervisor at the FBI. Whatever his neighbors were planning, he wanted it documented. He had a feeling this quiet Saturday morning was about to become anything but quiet. James had just finished his phone call with his FBI supervisor when he heard car doors slamming outside. Through his living room window, he watched 2 men in dark uniforms walking up his driveway with the kind of swagger that screamed fake authority from a mile away. The first man was tall and thin, probably in his 40s, with a patchy beard and a uniform that looked like it came from a Halloween store. His shirt had various patches sewn on, but James could tell from 20 feet away that none of them were from any legitimate law enforcement agency. The second man was shorter and stockier, with a shaved head and sunglasses that he wore despite the cloudy afternoon. James opened his front door before they could knock, stepping onto his porch with his hands visible and his posture relaxed. After 15 years in the FBI, he knew how to read people, and these 2 were clearly amateurs playing dress-up. "Afternoon, gentlemen," James said calmly. "What can I do for you?" The tall man pulled out a cheap-looking badge holder and flashed it quickly. "I'm Officer Thompson with Greenfield Heights HOA Security Division. This is my partner, Officer Davis. We need to speak with you about multiple violations of community standards." James almost smiled. There was no such thing as an HOA security division with arrest powers, and their badges looked like they came from a toy store. But he played along, curious to see how far they would take this charade. "What kind of violations?" James asked, leaning against his porch railing. Thompson pulled out a clipboard with official-looking papers. "Unauthorized modifications to landscaping, failure to maintain property according to community standards, and suspicious activity that has concerned your neighbors." "Suspicious activity?" James raised an eyebrow. "Like what?" Davis stepped forward, trying to look intimidating. "Like having people come and go at odd hours. Like receiving packages that could contain anything. Like behavior that doesn't fit with the family-friendly nature of this neighborhood." James felt a familiar calm settle over him. It was the same feeling he got when interviewing suspects, a mixture of professional focus and controlled anger. These men were accusing him of being suspicious simply for existing in his own home. "I see," James said. "And what authority do you have to investigate these alleged violations?" Thompson's chest puffed out. "We're certified security officers with full authority to enforce HOA regulations. That includes the power to detain and arrest individuals who refuse to comply with community standards." This was where James had to bite his tongue. No HOA security force had arrest powers. These men were either completely ignorant of the law or counting on him being ignorant. Either way, they were about to learn a very expensive lesson. "Interesting," James said. "Can I see your certification and your legal authority to make arrests?" Davis's face reddened. "We don't have to show you anything. You need to come with us for questioning or we'll be forced to arrest you right here. For what crime?
Failure to comply with a lawful order from a security officer, Thompson said.
Reaching for a pair of handcuffs on his belt, James noticed that several neighbors had emerged from their houses and were gathering on the sidewalk. Some had their phones out, recording the confrontation. Others were talking excitedly among themselves, clearly expecting some kind of show. Mrs. Peterson from next door was standing with a group of women, all of them watching with expressions that ranged from nervous excitement to outright glee. Mr. Harrison from across the street had brought a folding chair and was sitting down like he was at a sporting event. "You know what?" James said, still maintaining his calm tone. "I think there might be some confusion here. Let me get my identification so we can clear this up." He started to reach for his back pocket, but Davis immediately grabbed his arm. "Don't move. Keep your hands where we can see them." "I'm just getting my wallet," James explained. "No sudden movements." Thompson shouted loud enough for all the neighbors to hear. "We have reports that you might be armed and dangerous." James looked around at the growing crowd of neighbors. It was becoming clear that this wasn't just about two fake security guards. This was a performance designed to humiliate him in front of the entire neighborhood and hopefully provoke him into doing something that could be used against him later. "Armed and dangerous?" James repeated. "Based on what evidence?" "We don't need to provide you with evidence," Davis said. "We're conducting an investigation and you're interfering with that investigation." "Actually," James said, his voice taking on a slightly different tone, "I think you might want to reconsider your approach here." Something in his voice made both men pause. James had spent years interrogating terrorists and career criminals. He knew how to project authority without raising his voice or making threats. It was a skill that had saved his life more than once. "Are you threatening us?" Thompson demanded, but there was less confidence in his voice now. "Not at all," James replied. "I'm just suggesting that you might want to verify who you're dealing with before you go any further with this." He slowly reached into his back pocket and pulled out his wallet. Both fake officers tensed, but James moved deliberately and kept his hands visible. He opened the wallet and pulled out a black leather credential case. "James Walker, Federal Bureau of Investigation," he said, holding up his badge and identification card. The effect was immediate. Thompson's face went white and Davis actually took a step backward. But after a moment of shock, Thompson tried to recover. "That's fake," he said, but his voice cracked slightly. "Anyone can buy a fake FBI badge online?" James smiled for the first time since the confrontation began. "You're absolutely right. Anyone can buy a fake badge online, just like anyone can buy fake security uniforms and pretend to have law enforcement authority." He pulled out his cell phone. "Tell you what, why don't I call the real police and the FBI and we can sort out who has legitimate authority here?" "You can't do that," Davis protested. "We're in the middle of an official investigation." "Investigation of what exactly?" James asked. "What crime do you suspect me of committing? What evidence do you have? What's your probable cause for detention?" Thompson and Davis looked at each other, clearly realizing they were in over their heads. But the crowd of neighbors was still watching, still recording, and they had gone too far to back down now. "We have reports of drug activity," Thompson said desperately. "Multiple neighbors have reported suspicious packages and people coming and going at all hours." James laughed, a genuine sound of amusement. "Drug activity? I'm a federal agent specializing in organized crime. My suspicious packages are probably case files and evidence bags. The people coming and going are likely other federal agents working on joint task forces." The crowd was murmuring now, and James could see doubt creeping into some of the neighbors' faces. But Thompson was committed to his course of action. "We still need to search your property," he said, "for the safety of the neighborhood." "Do you have a warrant?" James asked. "We don't need a warrant. We're HOA security." "Actually," James said, his voice hardening, "you do need a warrant, and you're not HOA security with any legal authority. You're two men in fake uniforms who have just threatened to illegally detain a federal agent in the performance of his duties." He pulled out his phone again. "Now I really think it's time to call the real police." The moment James revealed his FBI credentials, the entire atmosphere on Maple Street changed. The two fake officers stood frozen like deer in headlights, while the crowd of neighbors began whispering more urgently among themselves. Some of the phones that had been recording suddenly disappeared into pockets and purses. Thompson, the taller fake officer, was sweating now, despite the cool afternoon air. He kept looking back toward the white sedan parked down the street, as if hoping for backup or an escape route. Davis, meanwhile, was staring at James's FBI badge like it might bite him. That can't be real, Thompson stammered, but his voice had lost all its earlier authority. You don't look like an FBI agent. James almost felt sorry for the man. Almost. And what exactly is an FBI agent supposed to look like? He asked, his tone remaining professional but with an edge that made several neighbors take a step back. I mean, Thompson floundered, realizing he had just stepped into an even deeper hole. You mean you think FBI agents can't be black? James finished for him. Or maybe you think they can't live in nice neighborhoods. Help me understand your thinking here. Davis tried to salvage the situation. Look, we were just following orders. We got a call saying there was suspicious activity at this address. We're just doing our job. Whose orders? James asked, pulling out a small notebook from his jacket pocket.
Who called you?
What agency do you actually work for? Let's start with some basic facts. The fake officers exchanged nervous glances. Thompson cleared his throat. We work for Neighborhood Security Solutions. It's a private company contracted by concerned residents. Neighborhood Security Solutions, James repeated, writing it down. Never heard of them. Are they licensed to operate in this county? Do they have insurance? Are their employees bonded? We don't handle that stuff, Davis mumbled. We just respond to calls. James looked around at the crowd of neighbors, his trained eye picking up details most people would miss. Mrs. Patterson was clutching her phone tightly, her knuckles white. Mr. Harrison, who had been enjoying the show earlier, was now looking uncomfortable and kept glancing toward his house like he wanted to escape. A woman James didn't recognize was standing behind a tree, partially hidden but clearly listening to every word. Tell me about this call you received, James continued, his voice taking on the tone he used during official interrogations. What specific suspicious activity was reported? What time did the call come in? Who made the report? Thompson was visibly sweating now. Multiple residents called about unusual behavior. People coming and going at odd hours, strange packages being delivered. Odd hours like what? Give me specifics. Well, early morning and late at night. James smiled without humor. You mean like someone who works irregular shifts? Like a federal agent who might get called out at any time of day or night? Those kinds of odd hours. We didn't know, Davis started. Of course you didn't know, James interrupted. Because you didn't do any actual investigation. You didn't check public records to see what I do for a living. You didn't verify any of the complaints. You just showed up here with fake badges and fake authority to intimidate someone you'd already decided didn't belong in this neighborhood. The crowd was getting restless. Some neighbors were starting to drift away, clearly uncomfortable with how the situation was developing, but others remained, including a small group of men who had positioned themselves near the fake officers, as if ready to provide support if needed. James noticed this too. His years of experience in hostile situations had taught him to be aware of every potential threat. The two fake officers were amateurs, but the men backing them up might be more dangerous. Here's what's going to happen, James announced, loud enough for everyone to hear. I'm going to call my supervisor at the FBI. Then I'm going to call the county sheriff's office. We're going to sort out exactly who these men are, who hired them, and what laws have been broken here today. You can't do that, one of the men from the backup group called out. They're just trying to keep the neighborhood safe. James turned his attention to the new speaker, a middle-aged man with graying hair and an expensive polo shirt. And you are? Tom Bradley. I live on Oak Street. I'm on the HOA board. Mr. Bradley, James said, still writing in his notebook. Are you telling me the HOA hired these men? Well, not officially, but not officially. So this is a private action by individual residents. James made another note. Who else is involved in this decision? Bradley looked around nervously, clearly realizing he had said too much. Look, we just want to maintain property values. We want to keep our families safe. Safe from what exactly? James asked. From federal agents? From black homeowners? Help me understand what threat I pose to your families. It's not about race, a woman called out from the crowd. It's about maintaining community standards. James looked directly at her. What standards have I violated? I've been living here for 3 months. I mow my lawn, I maintain my property. I don't have loud parties or disturb anyone. So what exactly is the problem? The woman fell silent, But James could see the answer in her face and in the faces of many of his neighbors. The problem wasn't what he did. The problem was who he was. Meanwhile, Thompson and Davis were getting increasingly agitated. They had clearly expected this to go very differently. They probably thought James would either be intimidated into leaving or would lose his temper and give them an excuse to call real police. "We're leaving," Thompson announced suddenly. "This has gone far enough." "Actually," James said, stepping slightly to block their path, "I don't think you're going anywhere just yet. You came onto my property making false claims of authority. You threatened to arrest a federal agent. You're impersonating law enforcement officers. These are serious federal crimes." "We never said we were real police," Davis protested. James consulted his notebook. "Let me quote you directly. You said you were certified security officers with full authority to enforce HOA regulations, including the power to detain and arrest individuals. You presented badges and claimed official authority. That's impersonation of law enforcement under both state and federal law. The fake officers were trapped now and they knew it. They couldn't leave because a federal agent was detaining them for questioning. But staying meant facing more questions they couldn't answer. Thompson made a desperate play. "This is harassment. You're using your position to intimidate private citizens." "I'm exercising my lawful authority as a federal agent to investigate potential crimes," James replied calmly. "If you have a complaint about my conduct, I'll be happy to provide you with the number for the FBI's Office of Professional Responsibility." He pulled out his cell phone. "But first, let's get some real law enforcement officers here to sort this out." As James began dialing, he noticed the white sedan that had been conducting surveillance earlier was now driving slowly past his house again. This time he could see there were 3 people inside, and they were clearly watching the confrontation with intense interest. The situation was escalating beyond just 2 fake officers and some concerned neighbors. This was starting to look like a coordinated effort involving multiple people and possibly multiple vehicles. James's FBI training kicked into high gear as he realized this wasn't just neighborhood prejudice. This was organized intimidation. "Sheriff's office?" James said into his phone, loud enough for everyone to hear. "This is Special Agent James Walker with the FBI. I need deputies at 1247 Maple Street in Greenfield Heights. I have 2 individuals impersonating law enforcement officers, and I believe there may be a larger conspiracy to intimidate a federal agent." The effect of those words on the crowd was immediate. Several more neighbors quickly headed back to their houses. Tom Bradley pulled out his own phone and started making urgent calls. And Thompson and Davis looked like they wanted to disappear entirely. But James wasn't done yet. He had 15 years of experience dealing with people who thought they could intimidate him, and these suburban amateurs were about to learn why he was considered one of the FBI's most effective agents. The sirens started as distant wails but grew louder quickly. James counted at least 3 different vehicles approaching from different directions. Thompson and Davis were now visibly panicking, looking around desperately for an escape route that didn't exist. "Relax, gentlemen," James said, his voice almost friendly. "You wanted law enforcement involvement. Well, you're about to get it." The first vehicle to arrive wasn't what anyone expected. A black SUV with federal government plates pulled up to the curb, followed immediately by 2 more identical vehicles. James smiled as he recognized the license plate on the lead vehicle. It belonged to his supervisor, Assistant Director Patricia Reeves. Thompson turned to Davis with growing horror. "Those aren't regular cops," he whispered, but his voice was loud enough for James to hear. "No, they're not," James confirmed. "Those are federal agents, my colleagues to be precise." Before the fake officers could respond, county sheriff's cars began arriving from the opposite direction. Within minutes, Maple Street looked like a scene from a crime drama, with multiple law enforcement vehicles, uniformed deputies, and federal agents in dark suits converging on James's front yard. Assistant Director Reeves stepped out of the lead SUV, and James could see she was not happy. Patricia Reeves was a 25-year FBI veteran who had worked her way up through the ranks by being tougher and smarter than everyone around her. She was also fiercely protective of her agents. "Walker," she called out as she approached. "What's the situation?" James gestured toward Thompson and Davis, who were now standing very still and looking like they wanted to sink into the ground. "These 2 gentlemen claim to be certified security officers with authority to arrest me for HOA violations." They presented fake badges and attempted to detain a federal agent. Reeves looked the fake officers up and down, with the kind of stare that had made hardened criminals confess to crimes they hadn't even committed. Is that so? Meanwhile, more neighbors had come out to see what was happening. The street was filling with people, but the mood was very different now. Instead of the hostile crowd that had gathered to watch James be humiliated, these neighbors looked nervous and uncertain. County Sheriff Martinez approached James and Reeves. "Agent Walker, we got your call. What do you need from us?" "These two subjects claim to have law enforcement authority they don't possess," James explained. "They attempted to detain me on my own property. I'd like them taken into custody while we sort out who they really are and who sent them." Sheriff Martinez nodded and signaled to his deputies. "You two step over here. We need to see some identification." Thompson tried one last desperate bluff. "We're working with the HOA. This is official business." "Show me your credentials," Deputy Johnson said firmly. "Real credentials, not whatever you flashed before." The fake officers reluctantly handed over their wallets. Deputy Johnson examined their driver's licenses and shook his head. "Ronald Thompson, unemployed. Gary Davis, part-time security guard at a shopping mall. Neither of you has any law enforcement certification or authority to detain anyone." "We were hired," Davis protested. "We were told this was a legitimate job." Assistant Director Reeves stepped forward. "Hired by whom?" "I want names, contact information, and details about who organized this operation." James noticed that Tom Bradley, the HOA board member who had spoken up earlier, was trying to quietly slip away from the crowd. "Mr. Bradley," James called out, "could you join us for a moment? I think Assistant Director Reeves would like to hear about the HOA's involvement in this situation." Bradley froze, then slowly walked back toward the group of law enforcement officers. His face had gone pale and his hands were shaking slightly. "Mr. Bradley," Reeves said, her voice deceptively calm, "Agent Walker mentioned you're on the HOA board. What can you tell us about these two men and their alleged authority to operate in this neighborhood?" We didn't hire them directly," Bradley stammered. "It was more of a community safety initiative. Organized by whom?" Bradley looked around desperately, but the neighbors who had been supporting him earlier were keeping their distance now. Several residents were concerned about property values and neighborhood safety. "Concerned about Agent Walker specifically?" Reeves pressed. "Well, yes, but not because of anything he did wrong. It's just that we weren't sure about his background and—" "So you hired fake police officers to intimidate a federal agent?" Reeves's voice was getting colder. "Is that what you're telling me?" "No, we thought they were real security." "We were told they had proper authority." James pulled out his notebook again. "Mr. Bradley, I need the names of everyone involved in organizing this. I need to know who contacted Neighborhood Security Solutions. I need financial records showing who paid these men. And I need it all now." The crowd of neighbors was thinning rapidly as people realized they might be witnessing the beginning of a federal investigation. Mrs. Peterson, who had been so friendly when James first moved in, was hurrying back to her house without making eye contact. Deputy Johnson was handcuffing Thompson and Davis when another vehicle pulled up. This one was a white van with Channel 7 News painted on the side. A reporter and cameraman jumped out and began setting up their equipment. "Great," Reeves muttered. "Just what we needed." The reporter, a young woman with perfectly styled hair and an aggressive manner, approached the group. "I'm Jenny Martinez with Channel 7 News. We received reports of a confrontation involving federal agents in Greenfield Heights. Can you tell us what's happening here?" James and Reeves exchanged glances. This situation was about to become very public very quickly. "No comment at this time," Reeves said firmly. "This is an ongoing investigation." But the reporter wasn't giving up. "Sir?" she called out to James. "Are you the homeowner involved in this incident? Can you tell us what happened?" Before James could respond, Tom Bradley made a critical error. Seeing the news camera, he apparently decided to try to control the narrative. "This is all a misunderstanding," he called out loudly. "We were just trying to maintain community standards. This man moved into our neighborhood and we had legitimate concerns about what?" The reporter interrupted, sensing a story. "What concerns did you have about your neighbor?" Bradley realized too late that he was digging himself into a deeper hole. "Well, his activities seemed suspicious. People coming and going at all hours. Strange packages. We were just trying to protect our families." So you hired security guards to investigate your neighbor? They weren't supposed to arrest anyone. They were just supposed to ask questions. The reporter turned to her cameraman. Are you getting this? James watched the disaster unfold with a mixture of professional satisfaction and personal sadness. These people had organized against him based on nothing more than prejudice and fear, and now they were about to face the consequences of their actions on the evening news. But the biggest shock was yet to come. As Thompson and Davis were being loaded into the sheriff's patrol car, Thompson called out desperately, "Wait! There are others. This was organized by more than just the HOA. There's a whole group involved." Assistant Director Reeves immediately signaled for the deputies to wait. "What group? Give me names." "I want a lawyer first," Thompson said, suddenly showing more intelligence than he had all day. "That's your right," Reeves replied, "but I want you to know that federal charges for impersonating law enforcement officers carry serious prison time. Conspiracy charges carry even more time. If you're thinking about cooperating, now would be the time to start." James looked around at his neighborhood, his dream neighborhood that he had worked so hard to afford. The beautiful houses, the perfect lawns, the quiet streets, it was everything he had wanted, but it came with neighbors who saw him as a threat simply because of the color of his skin. The irony wasn't lost on him. He spent his days protecting the country from actual threats, terrorists, organized crime, domestic extremists. But apparently, the biggest threat to Greenfield Heights was a federal agent who wanted to grow roses in his front yard. As more federal agents arrived to process the scene and interview witnesses, James realized this was far from over. Thompson's mention of others and a whole group suggested this incident was part of something larger and more organized than simple neighborhood prejudice. Assistant Director. Reeves approached him as the chaos continued around them. "Walker, I want you to know that we're going to investigate this thoroughly. If there's an organized effort to intimidate federal agents, we need to know about it." James nodded, watching as the news crew interviewed neighbors and captured footage of the federal response. "I have a feeling this is just the beginning," he said. 3 months later, James sat in his garden sipping morning coffee and reading the newspaper. The roses his mother would have loved were in full bloom, and the tulips Mrs. Chen had given him were preparing for their second season. The peaceful morning scene was a stark contrast to the federal courthouse where, just yesterday, the last of the conspiracy defendants had been sentenced. The investigation that began on that chaotic Saturday afternoon had uncovered something much larger than anyone expected. What started as fake HOA police trying to intimidate one federal agent had revealed a coordinated network spanning 3 counties, involving dozens of participants and targeting multiple minority homeowners in upscale neighborhoods. Thompson and Davis, the fake officers who started it all, had indeed been hired by Neighborhood Security Solutions, a company that existed only on paper and was funded by a network of HOA board members and concerned residents from multiple subdivisions. Their job was simple: create enough harassment and legal trouble to convince unwanted homeowners to sell their properties and move elsewhere. James had been their biggest target, partly because of his race and partly because someone in the network had discovered his job with the FBI and seen it as a challenge. They thought intimidating a federal agent would send a message to other minority families that nowhere was safe from their reach. They were wrong. The federal investigation, led by Assistant Director Reeves and a joint task force, had used the same techniques normally reserved for organized crime cases: bank records, phone taps, surveillance, and cooperation from Thompson and Davis, who quickly decided federal prison was worse than helping prosecutors, revealed the full scope of the operation. Tom Bradley, the HOA board member who had tried to control the narrative on that first day, received 2 years in federal prison for conspiracy and civil rights violations. 12 other residents across 3 neighborhoods received sentences ranging from probation to 18 months in prison. Neighborhood Security Solutions was shut down, and its founder, a man named Richard Stone who had been running similar operations in 4 states, got 5 years. But the real victory wasn't in the prison sentences. It was in what happened to the neighborhoods themselves. The federal investigation had triggered civil rights audits of all the HOAs involved. The Justice Department found patterns of discriminatory enforcement, selective rule application, and coordinated harassment that violated federal fair housing laws. Court-ordered reforms included mandatory diversity training, federal monitoring of HOA decisions, and substantial fines that funded affordable housing initiatives in each community. Greenfield Heights had been transformed. The fear and hostility that had greeted James when he first moved in had been replaced by a careful politeness as neighbors dealt with the reality that their actions had brought federal oversight to their exclusive community. Mrs. Peterson, his elderly neighbor, had been one of the first to apologize. She claimed she hadn't known about the organized harassment campaign and had been told James was involved in suspicious activities. When she learned he was an FBI agent working counterterrorism cases, she was mortified. She now brought him fresh vegetables from her garden and had become one of his strongest supporters in the neighborhood. The changes went beyond individual apologies. The HOA board had been completely replaced, with 2 of the new members being minorities who had moved to the neighborhood after the investigation made national news. Property values, contrary to the original residents' fears, had actually increased as the neighborhood gained a reputation for genuine community improvement rather than exclusion. James's phone buzzed with a text from his new partner, Agent Kim Rodriguez. "Ready for your big day?" Today was indeed a big day. James was being promoted to lead the FBI's new Domestic Terrorism Prevention Unit, partly because of his exemplary handling of the Greenfield Heights situation. His calm professionalism in the face of organized intimidation had impressed FBI leadership and demonstrated exactly the kind of judgment needed for the new position. But more importantly, the incident had highlighted a growing problem that law enforcement was only beginning to understand: organized residential intimidation that used fake authority and coordinated harassment to enforce illegal segregation. James's new unit would focus on identifying and disrupting these networks before they could expand. As he finished his coffee, James saw a moving truck pulling up to the house across the street. The Harrison family, who had been part of the original conspiracy, had quietly put their house on the market 2 months ago. James didn't know who the new neighbors would be, but he hoped they would judge him by his actions rather than their assumptions. A car pulled into his driveway, Agent Rodriguez arriving to pick him up for his first day in his new position. As James walked toward the car, he noticed something that would have been impossible 3 months ago. Several neighbors were outside working in their yards, and when they saw him, they waved and called out friendly greetings. "Morning, Agent Walker," called out Mrs. Chen, who was planting new flowers. "Good luck with your new job today." "Thanks, Mrs. Chen," James replied. "Have a great day." As they drove toward FBI headquarters, Rodriguez filled him in on his new responsibilities. The Domestic Terrorism Prevention Unit would work with local law enforcement agencies across the country to identify and disrupt organized intimidation campaigns. They would train local officers to recognize the signs of coordinated harassment, provide federal resources for investigation, and ensure that civil rights violations were prosecuted to the full extent of the law. "Your first case is already waiting," Rodriguez said, handing him a file folder. "Similar pattern to what happened in Greenfield Heights, but this one's in Arizona. 3 different minority families have been targeted by fake security companies hired by concerned neighbors." James opened the file and began reading. The pattern was almost identical: fake law enforcement officers, coordinated harassment, attempts to force minority homeowners to sell their properties. But this time, the perpetrators didn't know they were being watched by federal agents who had learned from the Greenfield Heights case. "Any federal employees involved?" James asked. "One of the targets is a Navy officer, another is a postal worker, both federal employees being harassed in their own neighborhoods." James smiled grimly. Then they picked the wrong people to mess with. As they pulled into the FBI parking garage, James reflected on the strange journey that had brought him here. 3 months ago, he had been a counterterrorism agent who just wanted to grow roses in his suburban garden. Today, he was leading a federal unit dedicated to protecting other families from the same kind of organized intimidation he had faced. The fake HOA police who had tried to arrest him had inadvertently created their own worst nightmare. A federal agent with personal experience of their tactics, the authority to investigate them nationwide, and the determination to ensure that no family would face what he had faced. James's phone rang as he walked toward the elevator. It was Assistant Director Reeves. Walker, I wanted to congratulate you again on your promotion, but I also wanted to let you know that we've received calls from civil rights organizations in 6 states about similar incidents. Apparently, what happened in Greenfield Heights wasn't an isolated case. I figured as much, James replied. These people are organized, they're coordinated, and they're operating in multiple states. But now we know their playbook and we know how to stop them. Any regrets about buying that house? Reeves asked. You could have had a quiet suburban life if you'd picked a different neighborhood. James looked out the window at the Washington, D.C. skyline, thinking about his garden back in Greenfield Heights and the community that was slowly learning to live up to its ideals rather than its prejudices. No regrets, he said. Sometimes the best way to change a neighborhood is to move into it. As the elevator doors closed and James headed up to his new office, he thought about all the families across the country who were facing the same kind of organized harassment he had experienced. They deserved to feel safe in their own homes. They deserved to be judged by their character rather than their appearance. And now, thanks to 2 fake police officers who had made the mistake of trying to intimidate the wrong federal agent, they would have someone fighting for them with the full resources of the FBI. The fake HOA police had wanted to make James disappear from their perfect neighborhood. Instead, they had created a federal task force dedicated to making sure their tactics disappeared from every neighborhood in America. Sometimes, James reflected, justice had a sense of irony.